So today we're in a Jaguar XJ, arguably the car that defined Jaguar. You can forget about your E-Types and your XK150s and the like. It was the saloons that made the brand that it is today. The XJ was first introduced in 1968, and the one that we're in now is the X350 generation, which is actually only the third all-new version that was introduced. The XJ series 1, 2 and 3 went from 68 to 86. The XJ40 took over from there, and that went through two subsequent reskins to bring the 300 and the 308, and then this, the X350. It was the saloon built under the Ford tenure, and under the skin is quite a radical aluminium architecture. It's rather than a conventional metal frame, it's aluminium made of extrusions and rivets and all bonded together with high-tech adhesives. And then aluminium panels attached to that. And of course what that's meant is it's a very lightweight and yet stiff bodywork. And yet despite its radical underpinnings, the outside of the car was relatively conservative with a small c. The styling was very much an evolution of the styling that we'd seen before. For all the Jaguar's radical underpinnings, they chose to go with a very conservative exterior. So they kind of stuck with the tried and tested format of twin front headlights and this sort of twin grille here. And I remember at the time when they unveiled it at the Paris Motor Show in 2002, they were busy trying to sort of test the reaction of journalists about what they thought, particularly of this egg crate grille, which was reminiscent of the Series 1 XJ. But for some reason, because it's maybe just a bit shallower or a bit plasticky, it just doesn't quite work in the same way, and the proportions of it just don't quite work like the 308 that it replaced. So I think the front of it, distinctly Jaguar, but not quite as elegant as the one before it. Front three quarters of it, again, just not quite as sleek or as elegant as the 308 that it replaced. The profile of the car, it's quite a handsome beast. The sort of proportions of the glass area and everything are quite good. It's interesting to note that in an 04 facelift they did away with these rubbing strips because otherwise the long lines are quite fussy. It's reported, it might be myth, but Callum did sort of try and meddle with this roof line. Whether he got away with it or not is depending on which story you believe. It slopes down to this long sort of trunk lid here, to obviously to give it some decent boot space, and actually that works quite well. And at the back here we've got the tail lights that are very reminiscent of the Series 3 XJ. So it's not an unattractive shape, it just, I don't think, has the same sleek elegance of the 308 that it replaced. Inside the car, the fascia is actually quite nice. It follows a pattern of the cars in the Jaguar range at the time, so the X-Type and the S-Type are very similar. So a huge fascia with this big infill of wood veneer. This one's got the bird's eye maple, but burr walnut was available on the higher spec models. And actually later cars you could even have full kind of aluminium effect to make it look a bit sporty, particularly on things like the XJR cars. You've got these three clear dials in front for fuel, water temperature, rev counter and of course speedometer, and a lovely classical analog clock in the middle there. And they've tried to sort of cover up any plastic with some leather-lined trim on the centre console and extensive use of chrome and piano black to give it a slightly more classy look and feel than you would have seen in the X-Type or the S-Type. There are still areas where I think it still feels a little bit cheap and flimsy. Some of the buttons, the switch gear are a little bit cheap, I would say, for the car that it's aiming to be. The glove box has got a lovely ergonomically situated chrome button to allow you to open the glove box from the driver's seat, but when you drop the glove box it just feels a little bit plasticky and a little bit flimsy. To prove it's a traditional British car, we've got the conventional sagging headlining that you get in a lot of cars of a certain era, so it's certainly living to its reputation there. But overall I think, despite some misgivings, the interior is actually quite a nice place to be. The seats are massively comfortable, really big leather chairs. Under the bonnet we've got the now a very well evolved version of the AJ V8. This is the 4.2 version, which was also introduced into the 2003 model year XK and S-Type. And it's a really good engine. In normally aspirated guys, it's 300 horsepower. And actually that's all the power you need. Remember, the 4-litre supercharged was 370, so it's not much less than the 4-litre supercharged original. It sounds great. It's refined when you want it to be, but it's also got that lovely get up and go roar when you want it to as well. It feels plenty quick enough while also being nicely refined as well. The steering is nicely well weighted. The brakes are good. Brakes on previous generation XJs were always a bit of a weak link, but I think they're a lot better on here, and actually more sporty versions came with Brembo upgrades if you wanted them, and they were really good anchors. They really helped slow the car down, because despite all that aluminium, it's still a heavy car. And as you can imagine, with a car that was aimed to bring the fight to the BMW 7 Series, the Audi A8 and the Mercedes S-Class, handling was put at the top of the list. And with the vehicle integrity director Mike Cross at the helm, he was very keen to make sure that the 350 handled as well as its competitors. But that also meant they tried to protect the ride quality, which was always a really important part of the XJ's repertoire. And their solution really was to use air suspension. And it's good to a point, but I have to say, I think the ride quality has suffered compared to the 308 that it replaces. And I think basically where it goes wrong is it's in certain road surfaces at certain speeds, particularly low speed roads where the road surface isn't perfect. I think it struggles to coset the road the way the previous models would have done, and particularly if you go right back to an early series car, there's no way that this competes. But I mean, that said, it's still a very comfortable car, and sometimes it's wheel specific as well. But having said all that, at the end of the day, what I like about the 350 is you could argue that if you like Jaguars to look like Jaguars, the 350 is the last car to do just that, and therefore it evokes a style, an elegance that Jaguar was known for back in the late 60s, and yet it's a modern car, so it can do all those things. So if you are someone who longs for a Jaguar that looks classic and elegant, then a 350 is a good place to start. You can buy sort of fairly down at hill versions with high mileage for, you know, £1,000, but good condition ones, good spec ones with decent mileage, you know, they'll be 10,000 plus. They're not without their perils. While the powertrain is reliable, there are some issues. I believe the climate control system can fail, and because sometimes it's dual zone, you'll find yourself that you can demiss some of the windscreen but not the other. I've known coil packs to fail on these V8s, relatively minor problems that cause it to go into limp home mode, and you know, replace the coil pack and you're sorted. And the air suspension can be temperamental. We've had problems on this one with air suspension failure warnings, which proved to be nothing more than actually a defective strut. Don't buy a cheap car and expect it to be then cheap to run. This is ultimately still at heart a £50,000 saloon, irrespective of what its value is today, so it will need proper TLC and maintenance to keep it on top of its game. So I think that's the important thing to remember when you buy one of these. It will always cost you a bit of money in terms of maintenance, but do that and it will run and run. So I just think that the 350, in a way, it's easy to perceive it as something, as an underdog. It's not perfect, but in many ways I still love it for that. My favourite XJ saloon was always the XJ40, because it didn't look like the Series 3 that it replaced. It was a little bit quirky, it had a reputation of being dog awful in terms of reliability. And the 350's done a bit of that as well. It tried to move the game on, but in many ways it took the 358 and the 351 that came later to be the car that it should have been. If you take it on board with those sort of frailties in mind and just accept it for what it is, I think the 350 is a fantastic car. Terrific value, great to drive, really refined. It's just a lovely place to be.